Welcome back to Financial Therapy. It's not just about the money. I'm personal financial planner, columnist, and financial therapist Rick Kahler. Research tells us that 90% of all financial decisions are made emotionally, not logically. For nearly 4 decades, I've been helping people make better money decisions. So what makes my financial worldview different from most financial experts? I blend the nuts and bolts of financial advice with the emotions that drive making them. Good money decisions are not just about the money. So let's get started with today's episode. Well, welcome back to another edition, and this just isn't another edition. It is the 2-year anniversary of the beginning of this podcast, which is kind of amazing for me to wrap my head around. I remember I was in a study group with Dimensional Fund Advisors on marketing. And this was, it was pre-pandemic. And I would go, and I was kind of the old guy of the group. And I never have really seen myself as a marketing person. This was a study group of people that were known for their marketing. And I kind of filled the book slot because most of them did television and podcasts. And I think to me, podcasts were something like what the internet was to me in 1996. I got on, messed around a bit, and I said, this thing isn't going anywhere. It's so slow. I don't see a future for this thing called the internet. I was wrong, wasn't I? And so when it came to podcasts, I just didn't quite get it, Audiobooks, yes, but it just didn't seem to me as anything that was going to be big. Well, of course, podcasts became very big. And the colleagues of mine that were in this study group that were doing podcasts, I mean, they were professional, focused. They were in some ways automated. They were targeted with who they're going after. I mean, they were podcast machines, marketing machines. And as I would listen to them in complete awe over what they were doing, it hit me, wow, I'm kind of behind the times here. And I've got a message in financial therapy that at that time, there wasn't another financial therapy podcast, except potentially one that I don't think is going anymore, out of Australia. But that was it. They were like, Rick, you could own this space. You really need to go after this. And I looked at the time and the focus that they put to this, and I just couldn't see it. Just all the time that it takes scheduling guests and coming up with the topics and the editing and then the production and the marketing. I mean, it's like almost a full-time job. And I have several full-time jobs. So I just told them, this is way too much work. I just don't see myself doing this. And as time went on, of course, the pandemic hit and my travel schedule came to an abrupt stop. I used to travel 1 to 2 weeks a month, and I'm home. And I had more time, but I hugely filled that time with doing online workshops. And it's not that I ever was lacking for anything to do. I also own a financial planning firm, and in the process of all this, started a financial therapy practice. So plenty to do. In fact, I have never been busier than the last 2 or 3 years. And that's a whole nother topic, one of which I'm working on in therapy. So I often tell people that maybe are stuck in something or trying to make a decision. If if you had a magic wand and you could wave it, what would you do? Because I had all these objections to doing a podcast. Another mentor of mine is a real estate mentor. Dee Fountain was her name. She had a great saying that has stuck with me to this day. And she was talking about offers that were made to sellers in this context. She says, basically, when you counter an offer, when you get an offer, you don't like it 100%, you respond or you make another offer back called a counteroffer. She said, I would tell my client, tell me what you will do, not what you won't do. That is really valuable advice. So I had a list of what I didn't want to do around podcasts. But I thought, well, if I could wave a magic wand, what would make doing a podcast as easy as possible that would fit into my flow? And I thought, well, I write a column every week. I've done so for over 30 years. And that takes a couple hours a week, 2 or 3 hours a week. I really didn't want to add writing something new or new content. And I thought, well, if I could do a podcast, because with my column, as many of you know, I record the column on YouTube. And that is scripted. I mean, basically, I'm reading the column on YouTube. And unfortunately, I think sometimes it looks like that. I try not to, but so that's very, very scripted and very easy to do, right? It takes me 5-6 minutes to do that. And I thought, if I could take what I'm writing in my column and just expand it and really go into the emotional side of the money, because my column is, it definitely has an interior bent on it around emotions, but it goes to, I think maybe 4 newspapers and it's a little bit more on the financial side, the financial planning side, than the therapy side. So what would happen if I took that column and I just expanded on all the emotional nuances that's in the column? I thought, well, I think that would be easy. At least I wouldn't have to be writing new material every week. And I also thought, in my mind, a podcast was an interview. You had guests on your podcast. And this just seemed overwhelming, that I would need to get a list of people, which wouldn't be hard. I know lots of the pioneers in financial therapy that would be very interested to have on. But I got to put them in my schedule and get into their schedule. And then we've got to record it. And then we've got to edit it. And I know I've appeared on a number of podcasts, and I look at the effort they put into that, all the reminders and the setting it up. And I'm just like, wow, I don't work that hard. What would be easy? Well, it'd be easy if it's just me. All right. There's not many podcasts that are just monologues, are there? And will people really want to just listen to you? And how quickly will I run out of material? Podcast number 5, number 6. But I decided, well, that would be easy if I just made the topic the weekly column and expanded it to the emotional side. And what would also make it easy? No script. I don't want to have to sit down. My average column is 600 words. And so that's about, like I said, 5-ish minutes of talking. Well, the package I purchased for my podcast has a maximum of 30 minutes. And most podcasts go 25 to 28 minutes. Well, all right. 5 times 6 is 3,000 words. That's a lot. That's half of a chapter in a book. No, I'm not going to sit down and write that. It's just going to need to happen spontaneously. So, no script. What else would make it easy? Well, I don't want to edit it. I want to sit down, take out the ums and the ahs and all of that stuff. So the podcasts generally are done with one shot. Every once in a while I'll get interrupted. A cat will jump up behind me or but not very often, and I have to splice those together. So I said, okay, we do it in one shot. I do it on the weekends. Typically the weekends are my writing and now my podcast time. And then it was like, okay, who's gonna lay this thing down, make the file on it? And I looked at a number of sources and found a company, I think they're out of England, called the Next Day Podcast. So I worked with them because the next thing I had to do is come up with opening music, the opening dialogue that you hear every time. That, I don't know how long I played with that, listening to all sorts of bumper music and playing it for colleagues and family, like what sounds good. So finally I selected the music. And then it's like, well, do I use my voice? Do I use somebody else's voice to open it up? We tried it both ways, and I decided it's probably better to use me. So cut that, and so they have that on file, and then I send them the episode. They put on the beginning, they put on the ending, and that's it. Send it back to us, and then I use something called Buzzsprout to put the episodes up on. So that may be more than what you want to know or care to know about how this thing is put together. It was kind of funny. My son told me, he's probably 19 when I started putting this together. He's now 21. And he says, yeah, Dad, your podcast music sounds like a boomer. Sounds like music a boomer would have. Well, I'm a boomer, so I guess it fits. So, and this takes me, I would say, a couple hours a week. It just depends, because sometimes the development is a little more involved than other times. There have been times that I've cut a podcast like this one. I am not writing a column on my podcast. So this is all off the cuff and is not following a column. So I've had a few like that. So I started laying these down in December of 2020. That's just as the first vaccines were rolling out. And I got about 9 or 10 episodes, it's called In the Can, before I released the first one. And the first one was, I think it was called What is Financial Therapy? So I've maintained that number in the can pretty religiously. I got it up to about 12, which gives me a little bumper, a little room, which was super helpful in January and February when I started traveling again and doing some speaking engagements. I also got pneumonia for 3 weeks and didn't put anything down during that period of time. So it really helps to have that cushion. Now the podcast, I wouldn't say this podcast has a huge following whatsoever. I mean, I've done nothing to promote it, right? So people just kind of have to stumble across it, or when I speak, I refer to it, or when somebody needs resources, I say, I got a podcast with a whole bunch of topics on it. Go take a listen and find the ones that appeal to you. So the average podcast at this time gets probably 200 to 300 downloads. It's kind of interesting. The all-time top listened to podcast has over 600 downloads. What do you think that one is? Well, it was the first one. What is financial therapy? I need to go back and listen to that and see what I said 2 years ago. And the second most listened to is the second podcast. And the third most listened to is the third podcast. And it just keeps going down from there. So I think I burnt people out on those first three. They're like, no, no, this isn't getting any better. Interestingly enough, the fourth and fifth most listened to podcasts were number 41 and 42 when I interviewed Barry Tesler. And as you know, Barry is the originator of the word financial therapy, at least her husband is, and is one of the first financial therapists, and has just a fantastic course, The Art of Money, and is a great marketer, great financial therapist. So that's some more trivia that may or may not be of interest to you. We just went over 20,000 downloads. Now there's some podcasts that do that in an episode, but like I said, my point here, I mean, I don't have any commercials. I'm not selling anything. This is just a labor of love to bring this information, bring what I've learned in the financial therapy landscape to the world, a little slice of the world. So I've always had this a tendency to want to teach and inform. I'm an Enneagram type 1, right? It's called the reformer. So I guess that goes with that particular type of energy. I teach at Golden Gate University, and I'm have completed, it's my seventh book. So I enjoy this, and quite frankly, I think one reason that I enjoy it is because I learn. When I have to explain something or state what I believe on something, it really takes me into a deeper place where sometimes I come out going, wow, didn't know I believed that. Or I kind of uncover stuff that I've never thought about. So that's part of what drives me around this. So what's next with the podcast? What's up for the next year or 2 years? Well, I really don't know. For the first time, I've started thinking about maybe this is enough. And I say that because as I researched podcasts, I was surprised at how many just went for 10, 20, 30 episodes and ended. I don't know what the average episodes are for a podcast, I suppose. That's another spontaneous question. I could Google it. So I don't know what is average for a podcast. Let me Google it right now and see if I get well, they say the average time is 37 minutes. So I guess I'm not too far off of that. But what's the average number of podcasts? Wow. The average person listens to 8 podcasts a week. That is amazing. If you have over 3,400 downloads, you're in the top 10% of podcasts. If you have over 9,000 downloads, you're in the top 5%. You got to be kidding me. And I have 20,000. Huh. Well, how about that? I had no idea. And sometimes I get asked, Rick, what podcast do you listen to? None. And that's, I'm not being snobbish. I wish I had the time. There's probably scores of podcasts I'd love to listen to. I just don't have the time. It's the same thing like Rick. What are you reading right now? Yeah, what I'm reading are about 30 books on my nightstand that are calling to me that I just hardly find the time to do it. We're in a book study in my financial planning firm right now by the Arbiter Institute on Self-Deception. So I am reading that book right now, but that's pretty rare. I write so much and I stay really current with things. And of course, I need to stay current financially and therapeutically. So I just don't have a lot of time. So the question is, what that I asked myself that I didn't answer, what's next? Well, I have thought about, how about I just quit? So I've been entertaining that, and I'll see, when it starts to become really hard to get new topics, that's probably a good sign. I have been amazed at the topics that keep coming up. You've heard me say how many times I've never talked about this on the podcast. So, but eventually that's got to end, you would think. So I thought about, well, I could go to start having more guests. I have found out that just having conversations is the easiest way to go rather than interviewing. There are so many people in the financial therapy world to talk to. I could easily fill podcasts with talking to these amazing and interesting people. It would take a little more effort. And I don't know how well received that would be. Now, based on my fourth and fifth highest listened to podcasts, which were interviews or conversations with Barry, people might like them. And I could appreciate that. I mean, how much of me can you listen to, right? So that's a thought that I've had. Another thought I've had is just ending this particular podcast. I mean, it'll be out there for as long as they keep podcasts up and be a resource. And then just maybe shift to a different focus. I thought about shifting to just a IFS, Internal Family Systems focus, since the last 2 books and 1 white paper that I've worked on are all about IFS informed financial therapy. So I could just do a podcast on that. It would have very limited audience, probably more limited than this podcast has. And it is my focus area of learning and passion at the moment. And then another podcast I could do is on the book that just was released that I co-authored with Deb Kaplan called Coupleship Inc. From Financial Conflict to Financial Intimacy. And it's a book written to the consumer. It's kind of like a do-it-yourself financial therapy book for couples. And it is unique in the fact that it does introduce IFS into that process. So I thought of doing that potentially with Deb, where we would just have a podcast series kind of bringing that book to life. And it could be also part of this podcast. So I don't know. And if any of you've got thoughts, what you'd like to hear, please let me know, Rick at rickkahler.com. I really appreciate the feedback that I get from many of you. Many of the sessions have been from topics and questions that you've asked. I appreciate that. So you can write me and say, Rick, shut it down. We've had enough of you. And maybe going toward more guests, or maybe just ending this podcast and going with a different focus. It might be what's called for. So I really appreciate your listenership. I run into many of you as I'm starting to travel, or even on Zoom calls, that say, yeah, I listen to your podcast. And I do really appreciate that. And like I said, appreciate your feedback and your support. So I think that's what I have to say about this podcast. I hope it's been of some interest to you to kind of look behind the scenes, get a little bit of history on the podcast and how it came about. I am appreciative to all the folks in the DFA Media Study Group that gave me a lot of suggestions and pointed me in the right direction to make this as easy as possible. And that was the key. So I do know I'll be doing at least a couple more episodes. So we'll just, we'll see where we go, because I, of course, have some in the can. All right. Thank you. Take care, and look forward to talking to you next week. Thanks for joining me, Rick Kahler, for another episode of Financial Therapy. It's not just about the money. This is where I combine the nuts and bolts of financial advice with the emotions that drive making them. Remember, every financial behavior, whether it appears illogical to you or others, makes perfect sense when we understand the underlying beliefs, feelings, and thoughts. Sign up for my weekly blog at financialawakenings.com. I hope you'll join me again for our next episode.